Okay, so again, don't forget here we have our factors of production. What determines how many we have and how effectively they're being used are the incentives, our old friends, expected marginal benefit and expected marginal cost. And what determines the incentives are the institutions. Now, since the institutions are the fundamental cause, let's zoom in on and look at those institutions. So rules. Rules matter, but which rules? Does driving on the left or the right-hand side of the street really matter? Maybe. Probably what's more important is driving on a consistent side of the street. And so the book breaks this up into 5 categories if memory serves. We can zoom in and get more specific. Again, rules matter, but which rules? So, starting off, we have property rights, honest government, political stability, dependable legal system, and open markets or openness to international trade. All right? So it's property rights. Basically, these are the rules governing access to and control over resources. In other words, do we know who owns what? And do we know what they can do with it? And then under what conditions can they transfer their ownership to somebody else? This doesn't mean private property rights necessarily. We can have communal property rights. We can have socialism, centralized property rights. One group owns everything. There's a variety of mechanisms. Now, as you may imagine, history has indicated that private property rights generally outperform a lot of the others because they are able to more effectively, it's a means of more effectively overcoming the information and the incentive problems. In effect, if you think about that big drop in China, what happened in that period was what was called the Great Leap Forward. In effect, the Chinese government communalized almost all property rights. So to land, to agriculture, the idea was that everybody would be self-sufficient and produce their own stuff. Now, as you may have imagined, when you engage in collective property rights, the incentive that I as an individual have, given that I only get a small share of the benefit that redounds to the community, but I incur the full costs, we would expect, in effect, pretty much everybody to shirk. And that's really what happened. We also had some natural disasters. We had some other things happen in China. But basically, estimates range between 25 and 35 million people died as a result, in a very short period of time, as a result of the Great Leap Forward, changing just the property rights. One of the greatest tragedies in human history. Some perspective that is far in excess of what the number of people Stalin killed in his Gulag system, and far, far in excess of the number of people that were killed in concentration camps and German concentration camps in World War II. So property rights clearly matter. But property rights are probably not the only thing that matter. So the rules of the game, that's kind of what we would call property rights. But we also have their enforcement. We could have very clear property rights about who owns what and what they can do with it. But if the people with the guns, if the government doesn't honor those property rights, then people will, again, not have a strong incentive to invest in and use effectively the factors of production. So you could think about this has actually been the United States Constitution, which specifies sort of a bunch of property rights, in effect, has been adopted hundreds of times around the world in various countries at various points in time. And in almost none of those countries has it yielded anything like what we have seen in this country. Why not? Well, because generally speaking, the regime that was putting it in place was more concerned with extracting all the goodies they could get from their population than they were about actually putting in place and enforcing those property rights. So you can view as property rights are, they tell us who can do what. And honest government is, do the people with the guns enforce and honor those property rights? We also have political stability. Now, this here is not a case of one party in power. On the surface, it might look like the United States is not very politically stable. We tend to have turnover fairly quickly. for maybe 8 years of the presidency. Sometimes that runs 12 years, one party staying in power, maybe 16, but usually we have a fair bit of turnover. Compare this with what we see in many other countries like Togo. Togo had a dictator for 35 odd years. Now his son has taken over on the surface, and his son has been running it for 20 odd years, maybe a little bit less. Actually, a fair bit, maybe 15 years now. So on the surface, Togo is far more politically stable than the United States, or than Britain, or Canada, or many other places. Same thing with China. China is very politically stable in the sense of one party basically runs everything. There's not a lot of uncertainty as to whether the Communist Party is going to get voted out of office next year. Actually, there's no doubt that it will. There's no doubt that it will be in power in 5 years, really. Not at least through the normal system. So when we're talking about political stability, we are not here talking about dynastic rule. What we're actually talking about is how understandable and predictable the process is. So behind the scenes in China, behind the scenes in Russia currently, behind the scenes in Togo, there is a lot of uncertainty as to what the current leadership is going to do to keep power, what would happen if they lost control, and basically there's a lot of uncertainty about that. Whereas in the United States, most of us don't expect that if Donald Trump lost the next election, and this is not in any way, shape, or form prognostication that he will, but I think most of us expect that if he lost the election, he would turn over power. He wouldn't say, nope, I'm calling out the National Guard and I'm going to lock up the other people who are competing with me. Which means that while the identity of our political leadership changes a fair bit, our system is quite politically stable. This is not true around the world. Okay, so property rights, honest government, and political stability. So if honest government can be viewed as the government elite avoiding expropriating from their citizenry, having a dependable legal system can be viewed as, do we have a system in place to allow private citizens to get their property rights honored when in contention for control with other private citizens? In other words, if we've signed a contract that you're going to deliver a service to me and you don't, after having received payment, can I take you to court and get you to honor your contract? Now, there's a whole bunch of law and economics questions to ask here. There's a whole bunch of other pieces to delve into. But in effect, that's the big picture piece here for the legal system. This one is really the rules of the game. While property rights are the rules of the game, dependable legal system would really be their enforcement. And so it's not just what the rules are, it's also, are they enforced effectively? And finally, it probably shouldn't be any big surprise given how much time we spent on international trade and trade generally and the value of exchange and the fact that trade generates value and that it is an act of production just like manufacturing, is we could have all these things, but if we do not have open markets, if we cannot trade with the rest of the world, that will very much attenuate our ability to grow. It will keep us from tapping into larger collective brains. It will keep us from tapping into higher degrees of specialization, because specialization, as we mentioned, is limited by the extent of the market. If you have a small market, you're only going to be able to have a certain level of specialization. It also turns out that open markets can serve as a fairly effective check on many of the excesses of both legal systems and governments. If capital can move internationally, if goods can move internationally, if you have open markets, the other things, there's going to be a stronger constraint on the executive, on the Senate, on the Congress, etc., on the Parliament. Okay? So open markets is another large category. Again, the book has a decent discussion of this. So, here's our sniff test for that. And again, I should probably blank this out, But one of the questions would be, does this look the way it should, based on our theory? In other words, our theory is that institutions determine the incentives to invest in and use effectively the factors of production, which yields greater GDP. So what this is on the horizontal, if we look at it, we have less corrupt to the left, we have more corrupt to the right. So we could view it as we have a more honest government to the left and a less honest government to the right. Does this look the way it should if having a more honest government yields greater levels of social coordination? And the answer is yes. If you look, it should look like a demand schedule, because there would be an inverse relationship between corruption and between GDP per capita. So this really is in effect our sniff test that institutions do matter. This is not the limit of the literature. There's a huge amount of literature. There's a huge amount of research. In 2020, I think it was, there was a seminal paper by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson that it was entitled "Institutions as the Fundamental Cause of Long-Run Growth." And there were a lot of data issues with how do we actually disentangle this? How do we make sure that other theories don't have more weight, don't have merit? Although the consensus is that yes, it is the institutions, and that shouldn't be a huge surprise given what we saw with North and South Korea. There may have been other determinants in terms of why some countries started growing earlier than others, how they were able to break the 12,000-year trend, the 12,000-year cycle. However, at this point, now that we figured it out, it's pretty clear that the key is what's happening with institutions. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy to improve institutions, because the next question would be, is it incentive compatible for the current elite to foster, grow, and respect good quality welfare generating institutions? And in much of the world, the answer is no. The people like Vladimir Putin, the people like Faure, Edema, and Togo, they actually stand to lose more from an effective country and effective institutions than they do from extractive institutions, where where the pie is much smaller, but their share of that pie is much, much larger.